winter chill. The snow fell on an icy earth, the green of the grass easily seen despite the winter snow, though one could feel easily the chill of the stiffening air. It blew across Winchester's face, yet he stood still, as easily so as the winter air, through his thick armor, froze him nearly to the bone, and grew his hands stiff as he clenched with his right hand on the haft of the blade at his side. A long sword with a crimson jewel, a ruby, cast well into the end of it. He was a warrior, had been at least, a warrior of the Fifth Army to ever form under Queen Aisla's rule. All others had fallen. Winchester, or Hester to some, knew it well, as he had served in both the Third and the Fourth Armies, which had fallen quickly. The others they had fallen a generation ago, the strongest of which had been the Second, comprised of many of the same men. But the hordes were a hard struggle, a difficult fight. Many a man did die there on the battlefield against them. Hester felt that he could feel it now, quaking in his bones, the rumble of the marching of the men, their boots thumping against the earth beneath the weight of their iron-clad torsos, their breathing and their shouting palpable to those nearby. Yet he did not shake, despite these thoughts, despite the cold. He was steady, he was prepared, though he knew to his deepest sadness he would not fight today. He was a deserter. The queen, if he had been well known enough, would have had his head, and he was sure if anyone recognized him on the road they would try to capture or kill him, as there was a heavy reward for such action, such a desertion. Hester smiled at the thought. Unless there were 10 or perhaps 15 men, all at once, he knew that any man attempting to capture him would be easy prey, and he would kill them easily. And alongside his brother, you might as well send an army, he thought easily to himself. Although he was a great warrior, he had never been recognized by the queen but once, and she had easily forgotten him. There were many great warriors in the army, though Hester would have bested many or most of them. His sword skill was such. No, he was not a loud man. He did not boast of his talent. He did not boast of anything. In fact, he spoke only to his brother most days. It was not so much that he feared the conversation of other men, but that he did not care to speak to them. He regarded most as lesser and therefore unworthy of his conversation, and as was evident for his desertion of the army, he did what he pleased, when he pleased, and because it pleased him. That was all, and he wanted nothing more but good food, good drink, and perhaps a good woman to keep him company. As far as women were concerned, he couldn't stand many of them either, except that it was different with women, as he did not wish to harm them as he did men. He simply would rather not speak to them except for the quietest of them, those who were yet quieter than even he was, because it made him feel more comfortable, he supposed, though many women found him suitable by the looks of him, and he had no problem finding a woman, even if she were not a quiet, suitable woman to lie with. His brother, on the other hand, had a more difficult time, because he oftentimes, Hester knew, cared for the woman he was chasing instead of simply waiting for them to chase him. It did not hurt, of course, that Hester was quite good-looking, where Alep was not bad-looking, but perhaps a more plain version of his brother, and with red hair, which for some reason women did not enjoy. Hester's hair, when he was younger, had been a bright blonde, but as he had grown older, it had grown darker, and become a dark brown, though it did not much matter. It was simply hair. Whether he had it or not, women would still love him, and Alep, if he could just get over himself, Hester often thought, sadly for his brother, he would find a suitable woman to bed and to make his wife, but now was not the time to think of such things. Now was the time to prepare and to plan, so Hester replaced his personal thoughts with thoughts of the dilemma at hand. A man approached to his side on horseback as Hester was. His brother, Alep Hale's rider, a last name that Hester shared. Neither had a middle name, as it was not their custom, though the men of the hordes, as they called them, the hordsmen, did carry with them a last name. Their way was not so, or a middle name. Their way was not so personal, as Alep sometimes put it, and Hester agreed. Their way and the way of their brothers and sisters was not so personal as was that of the religion of the hordsmen, who worshipped a ram god, a bloody god, obviously. Theirs was the owl god, all-seeing, even in night, and all-knowing, though perhaps his powers only extended to the strength of the size of the army under the queen, Hester sometimes thought, though it did not matter. He had sworn his life to this duty and this duty alone, an oath bound in blood, spit, and steel. He had killed a man for the right. He supposed the queen often said that he was not, that their owl god, who had no name other than the Great One, or the Knowing One, was too a bloody god, or perhaps Hester dared not say it, It was simply the queen who was such a killer. Hester smiled at the thought, and then, looking at his brother, spat on the ground and watched it as it quickly froze before speaking. "Brother, I tell you," he said before stopping. "You tell me what?" Alep asked, somewhat upset, though he was not upset at Hester, no. It was something else, Hester knew. "Our sister," Hester spoke calmly. "She has been raped, if not killed by now." Alep breathed in hard and cocked his head back in a sort of controlled anger. "Yes, brother, I know." "Perhaps then you might think it best to attack now," Hester said. "Yes," Alep said, as enraged as anyone would be given the situation, though not Hester. Hester smiled calmly. "We will not." "And why not?" Hester growled at him, almost bitter, if he weren't so inflamed. "Because," Hester said, "they will kill us." "Then so be it," Alep said, gritting his teeth. Hester chuckled slightly. "We cannot save our sister if we are dead, Alep." "And what do you suggest we do? Leave her?" Hester looked at him seriously now. "Alep, you know I would never suggest such a thing." "You were never fond of her," Alep growled again. "No," Hester said, "but she is my sister. I love her as you love her." Alep looked at him a moment and then nodded. "I am sorry, brother." "I know," Hester said, taking a moment to look at the frozen earth before again speaking. "We will save her." He turned and rode away. "Yes," said Alep, following suit. "We will save her." The castle, a darkened gray with black soot from attempted explosions from past battles, could not be breached, it was said. It loomed there in the distance from the crest of the hill at which they had stood staring back at them, a death pit surely if they attempted to enter it. How many men were inside? Well, Hester had an estimate, but admittedly he did not know. He hoped many, as he would have to blend, to sneak inside and become one of them temporarily, but Alep already knew that. It was but the two of them. They had no armies, no fortress, and only a small wealth by which to make it by, from their raiding in spring, summer, and fall. Now that it was winter, they waited, but for their sister they could not wait. At least not long, though they would. Indeed, they would wait. They let the day pass as they watched the fortress. They searched for any sign of weakness it may have, a side door, unguarded or lightly guarded, a broken wall, anything that might allow them to enter easily. The men inside looked as they did, with varying armors and long hair, so they would not have a difficult time blending once it entered. It was simply the entering that was the difficult part, so they watched the entire day, eating into their small food provisions, which in truth were not that small, but would only last them maybe a few days if they ate lightly. Alep grew anxious and angry, but Hester kept his eyes open and contained his anger, showing none of it. He was calm, he was ready, and when he spotted the weakness, he knew exactly what to do. "Look," he said to Alep in a calm tone. "What?" Alep said. "Those carts there," Hester pointed. "What of them?" There were 4 large carts sitting outside of the fortress, empty. They had not been there in the morning. "Food suppliers," Hester said. "Ah," Alep began to grin. "So we act as one of them." "Yes," said Hester, smiling. "That is what we do." As night fell, they prepared, though they lit no fire. Behind them stood a large forest, and leaning against one of its trees, Hester fell quietly to sleep, awaiting the next day, in which he would enact out his plan, Alep alongside him. The freezing cold did not reach him, despite his chilled armor, as he wore many furs, both on his wear and over himself as a blanket. His horse was tied and fed to a tree nearby. Alep's horse, too, tied there. As he rested quietly, Hester wondered why they had taken her and what it was they were hiding from, as they must have been hiding from someone, expecting some invading force of some kind, of some men. Else why would they remain in their fortress, delivering food daily? Whatever war or battle was to come, Hester knew that he wanted no part in it. He would have to act quickly, and he hoped that tomorrow would be enough time. That the carts did come daily, as they surely would. The peasants would supply their lordship in the fortress as the days passed in preparation for whatever was coming. Hester grinned. They should not have taken his sister, and their men would go hungry for the day, as he would take some of the cart's food supply and dump the rest into the woods, stopping them on the path leading to the fortress gates. Although, perhaps they had enough food anyway. He knew the path they had taken. There was only one, and for quite a many miles. He would kill every one of them, leaving none alive. The poor peasants, he thought. It would not be the first time that he made the kill on such men, and he did not feel guilt for it, though sometimes he lamented it very much. As the morning came, Hester awoke, the sun shining in his eyes as the fortress, of which he faced from his somewhat upright position against the tree trunk, faced the west, meaning that he faced the east, where the sun did, of course, rise. There was a sly grin and a furrowed eyebrow creasing Hester's face that morning, as he knew that he would deliver the blade on these innocent men, though he regarded no man as entirely innocent. He enjoyed it was true, the killing. He was good at it, but he was not a sick man, not in comparison to other men, many of them. At least that's what his brother always told him, perhaps justifying his deadly behavior, although it was fairly normal for these lands. Hester always did think to himself, and his father, when he had been just a boy. He remembered that the many beatings he endured, to say the very least, but he did not torture men. He simply killed them, quickly, quietly, without a word, earning him respect easily. He hoped that they would be loud men, the men on the road, as they were easy to spot, and he enjoyed quieting them, as he was. His brother called him the Silent Sword, a name that would have stuck if anyone knew of him, and perhaps one day they would. He carried 2 swords, each fastened in scabbards as a crossroad on his backside by 2 thin leather straps. He was right-handed, and so his right sword slightly longer than the left, as was his preference. His knife was a long one, roughly the size of a quarter sword, its name reflecting such description. The quarter blade, or quarter, was its common name. Hester preferred his swords, but in close combat or in a shield wall, the quarter was as useful as his long swords were useless, and so it was a necessary weapon to wield and carry. He remembered his father had trained him with it as a boy, and he had disliked using it, but over the years he had grown to love it, even sometimes using it in combat, open combat, instead of long swords to display skill. Alep was different, and perhaps somewhat less skilled, though still highly skilled, than Hester. He'd endured a childhood similar to Hester, though decidedly not quite as vicious, if one could make such a discernment. Alep often told Hester that Hester had it much worse than he, and Hester would always shake his head and claim that they both had a hard time back then. And Alep had reacted to it through anger and rage and emotion. Hester, though not devoid of it, did not express himself much. Instead, he thought he planned, he killed well, and he made a name for himself wherever he went without speaking, though he spoke often enough. Just not as often as other men, and so that was often his reputation, and all knew him, or nearly all. Even the queen knew him, but for whatever reason, that woman, she would never acknowledge him. Perhaps it was because she was queen, but Hester had often suspected that she simply had never liked him or how he was, but he had always done his job well. Never well enough, however, to her liking, and so Hester did not regret leaving. Admittedly, he would have left anyway. He had an obligation, his sister. He knew that he must rescue her, though she, too, he had never enjoyed. She and Alep had always had a better relationship, but she had always been competitive with Hester, who was oldest by a year. Perhaps it was that she was the middle child because of him, as she used to often tell him as a child, or perhaps she simply had mimicked their father, as she was quite like him. Hester knew, and perhaps she was jealous of the attention their father had given to him, however horrible it had been. He had beaten her, too. Hester sometimes jested with her. Perhaps he often said she had wanted to be beaten more, as a horse sometimes enjoyed to be beaten. Hester did not care for her attitude, but he never took her seriously. It was part of why she hated him, and she did hate him, though he did not hate her. He loved her. She was his sister. He loved her as she loved Alep, however terrible she had been, and perhaps still was. He did not know, as he had not seen her for some time, perhaps 3 years. He could not remember exactly. It could have been 2, and it could have been 4, but his mind would not allow him to recall it, and he did not press the matter to himself. It was of no import, and now, anyway, the men on the road did march, food carts in hand, making their way towards the fortress entrance. He could see them at a distance, as they were a distance from the palace. He would be able on horse to intervene before they were in the eyeshot of it, as the road bent. One part, the part they were marching on, was covered from castle eyesight by forest. He would kill them. Alep, he called quite loudly. Alep awoke. "What is it?" he asked groggily. "Get up. It's time." Hester grinned. "Time for what?" Alep growled. Hester looked seriously at his brother before again grinning. He spoke maliciously. "It's time to fight."